Well, welcome back, everybody. It's a nice, small, intimate group this morning, and especially a welcome to Michael, who's joining us this morning from Port Macquarie. I think Michael has met Ryan before, and possibly Jill, I'm not sure. Hi, Michael.
It's Mitchell.
Oh, sorry, Mitchell. Sorry. Thank you for that. Yeah. Welcome, Mitchell. We don't get to see enough of you. So today is Sunday, the 8th of June, 2025, and I've prepared a talk for today. So I'll walk through the talk very slowly, and if you want to ask a question during the talk, please feel free to do so. Just raise your arm or just unmute yourself and ask me a question if there's something that's not very clear or you're finding difficult to understand. There will be time, hopefully, for a discussion at the end of today as well, because we finish at about 12:30. So I've called the talk today, Taking Refuge in Affirming Self-Experience. Interesting topic. And when I'm talking about taking refuge, I'm talking about the traditional refuge in Mahayana Buddhism. It's with the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And in our Zen Buddhist tradition, during a Jukai ceremony, we take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So this talk is an example of the ongoing project initiated by my teacher, Barry Magid, of integrating a relational self psychology approach into Zen practice or spirituality in general. So in this case, I'm going to be talking about integrating Heinz Kohut's concept of the self-object experience into Buddhism's three refuges. So when the interesting thing about Heinz Kohut, who was a psychoanalyst who died in around about 1981, he was one of Barry's main mentors. Barry didn't know him personally, but he was a great influence on Barry's work as a teacher and as a psychoanalyst. And Kohut's often seen, from an American point of view at least anyway, as probably one of the most significant innovators in psychoanalysis since Sigmund Freud. But as probably you appreciate, Sigmund Freud was very cynical about religion, given the fact that he was late 19th century, early 20th century. His thinking was very much informed by the science of those days. So he, from a scientific point of view, he thought religion was a nonsense. But even from a clinical point of view or a psychological point of view, he felt that religion was a kind of infantilizing projection onto some kind of father. So he was very, not very positive about religious experience. On the other hand, Heinz Kohut didn't place religion at the forefront of his life. He was primarily a psychoanalyst, but he was a member of the Unitarian Church in the United States. The Unitarian Church is a very liberal church, a very open and inclusive church. So Heinz Kohut had a much more positive view of religion, and this concept of the self-object was very important in his understanding of why religion is important to a lot of people. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, the first thing I'm going to do is make a distinction between what I'm calling dialogue narrative and experience. And then I'm going to talk about what Kohut meant by self-object experiences. This concept of a self-object was a kind of familiar language to psychoanalysts. For those of you who are not psychoanalysts, basically, when psychoanalysts talk about objects or self-objects or object relations, they're talking about how relationships are internalized. So the object is that which is internalized. So, for example, you could, if one had a very critical mother or a very critical father, then there could be a very critical object within ourselves that was very critical of us. So analysis, when they talk about objects, they're talking about the way in which relationships were internalized intrapsychically. I'm going to talk about, rather than talk about self-objects, I'm going to talk about self-affirming experiences. I think it's a more friendly kind of language, and for the purpose of, non-psychoanalysts. So the purpose of this talk today is to show how we can give a psychological interpretation of taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha from a relational self-psychology perspective, and therefore continuing to highlight how our approach in Ordinary Mind Zen is psychologically minded, not into the extent that we want to get rid of spirituality, but to understand psychology and spirituality as being not separate, but a healthy psychological development can include spirituality or religion in that development. So they're not in conflict with each other. But it's important to have a psychological perspective so that, for example, we don't engage in what's called these days spiritual bypassing. That's another issue which I won't go into today. So the distinction between dialogue and narrative, or dialogue, narrative, and experience. So in my professional journey as a psychotherapist, it's been all about integrating the place of dialogue and narrative in psychotherapy with our self-experience. So our self-experience fluctuates from moment to moment, often depending upon the dialogue or narrative we are telling ourselves or participating in with others. But our self-experience also fluctuates on the basis of the relational responses that we find ourselves being impacted by, or, importantly, the activity we find ourselves participating in. So I've come to see both dialogue-narrative and self-experience as complementary processes that I personally integrate within a single session of psychotherapy, but also during the long-term course of psychotherapy. And I think it's a really good way of understanding ourselves when we try and understand this sort of circular relationship between dialogue and narrative and how we experience ourselves in the world. But also I want to give some attention to how not just dialogue and narrative, but how activities can also shape our experience of ourselves and the world. My first training in psychotherapy was in what is called narrative therapy. So I learned the importance of telling and retelling stories from Michael White, who created narrative therapy, an Australian therapist in Adelaide. Michael made the point that we interpret our experiences by telling stories. However, by doing this, we often miss crucial aspects of our experience. He concluded that our lived experience is always more diverse and richer than the stories we can tell about it. Hence, our stories are always able to be revisited and revised. These stories can be aligned with our preferred values and identities and be supportive of our self-determination. Or the stories we find ourselves telling can be oppressive and marginalizing of our values and identities. Stories, therefore, either consciously or unconsciously, are continually shaping how we experience our life and our relationships. For example, if we are identified with an inner dialogue of personal failure, it disconfirms our sense of self-worth, and we can be overwhelmed by shame and depression. However, what Michael White failed to notice, in my opinion, is that there are experiences that have an impact on people, not just in relation to the stories we might tell about these experiences. So, for example, I might climb a mountain, and the very action of climbing a mountain will have an impact on my self-experience. I may experience a sense of well-being simply by accomplishing the activity of climbing the mountain. Or substitute any other activity from your experience that might give you a sense of accomplishment and well-being. It doesn't have to be climbing a mountain. But this is just the example I'm using. The following day after climbing the mountain, I tell the story of climbing the mountain to a friend. The friend listens empathically. And by telling the story, I re-experience a sense of well-being. And hence, I'm able to maintain that sense of well-being throughout the day. Or, alternatively, in a parallel universe, I tell the story of climbing the mountain to another friend who does not listen empathically and who dismisses my experience by saying, geez, my 90-year-old grandmother could climb that mountain without any problems. Colloquially, we would describe that comment as a put down. In psychological language, we could describe it as a small t trauma of non-recognition. The response from my friend is disconfirming of my experience, and hence I experience either a major or a minor blow to my self-esteem, depending on the current state of myself at the time I receive the put down. If we're feeling really good about ourselves when someone puts us down, we can be really resilient and get through it okay. But if we're already feeling depleted or depressed and someone puts us down, it can be a major blow. So actions like climbing a mountain and dialogue stories work together, and they can either affirm our self-experience of well-being, for example, or disconfirm our self-experience of well-being. So that's the lead-in now to talking about what Kohut's self-object experiences. We don't have a self, because this implies, if we say we have a self, it implies there's an owner of the self, which leads us into an infinite regress. Rather, you are a person who uses the language of self or the language of selfhood to talk about your emotional experience. And this experience is continuously changing and fluctuating, depending upon the context you find yourself in, especially the dialogical context you find yourself in. In order to talk about emotional experience, we have to use metaphors. Often these metaphors are based on our lived experience of the body. For example, all the metaphors of being wounded, which we apply to our emotional self-experience, wounded, hurt, felt like he stabbed me in the back, etc., are derived from the body. So it is important to recognize that the self is not a thing just because we use that kind of language, but it's an experience that's in continuous flux depending upon the context. And we're just using those kinds of metaphors to describe in language what it feels like. And the kind of metaphors we often use are derived from our bodily experience. Now, before I discuss the three refuges, I want to locate the concept of self-experience in the work of Heinz Kohut. The most important insight I gained from studying self-psychology was the self-object experience. I need to explain that. The self-object experience was the description Kohut used for how the client experienced the person of the therapist. It is describing the client's experience, not the person of the therapist. A self-object experience is not, for example, I found Andrew to be a kind and supportive person. It's more like this. Often during my sessions with Andrew, I feel a sense of calmness. Or after the session with Andrew, I felt calm and more optimistic about my future. So you can see the difference. The self-object experience is how the client experiences that relationship. It's not about the person of the therapist. So Kohut worked with clients that had been diagnosed with narcissistic self-disorders. So these kinds of people suffered the trauma of non-recognition in childhood, and who consequently were very sensitive to criticism or being ignored, because that was the kind of environment they grew up in as children. This is a quote from a book by a guy called Ernest Wolfe, who's a self-psychologist, about Kohut's concept of self-objects. So Kohut claimed that when a patient with a narcissistic injury met a therapist who responded empathically, the unmet needs of childhood would be reactivated and eventually manifest in what he called the self-object transferences. These are self-object experiences. The self-object, when it is functioning well, evokes and maintains the self and its concomitant sense of selfhood. This is an intrapsychic event and is subjectively experienced. Self-object relations or experiences were what Kohut focused on. These experiences, these self-object experiences, are not objectively observable from the outside, so to speak. They are not events in an interpersonal context. The only way we can have access to them is through our own experience or by introspection and empathy. So from this work, Kohut discovered what he called three basic self-object transferences or self-needs that he later universalized as the basic self-needs of all human beings throughout the course of the life cycle. The first one is mirroring needs. The need of the child to be affirmed, confirmed, recognized, to be feeling accepted and appreciated, especially when able to show oneself. And all these needs certainly present in childhood, but they continue throughout the life cycle. We don't outgrow these needs. The second one was idealizing needs, the need to experience oneself merging into a stable, calm, wise, protective, admired other that possesses the qualities the subject feels they themselves lack. The affirming self-experience arises from being connected to the person who is admired, and the idealizing is the mode of connection. I may feel something of their strength and calmness flowing into me. This can also arise through practicing an activity like Zazen or playing music, because as the self-object needs become more mature, and as we grow into adults, we can get our needs met not just from relationships, but from activities. And that's what I'm going to come back to later on. Activities like Zazen or playing music, for example. This experience can also arise through a sense of connection to the natural environment as well, the earth and the sky, mountains and stars, rivers and seas, which is also important when it comes to Zen practice. The third need he talked about was the feeling of being at home, or twinship needs, the sense of belonging. So the need to experience an essential likeness with the self-object, evoking the sense of belonging, the feeling of being at home, like finding a friend who really gets you, or being in that club where we all share similar values, the Dead Poets Society idea. You know, we found that sense of belonging. So now I'm going to talk about the Buddhist refuges, the 3 refuges. I'm going to talk about them as self-affirming experiences. When we are taking refuge in the Buddhist sense, we are not taking refuge in something which is external to us. Basically, what we're saying here is that we're taking refuge in what Kohut called the self-object experience, or what I am calling self-affirming experiences. Like the self, the 3 refuges are a metaphor. They have the etymological roots in shelter and protection. So when we say Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Saraman is the Pali word for protection, often translated as refuge. So when we say I take refuge in Buddha, I take refuge in Dharma, I take refuge in Sangha. But these refuges are not a place to hide. They're not like a defense to keep the world outside away. Rather, they are affirmations of the self, allowing the self to open, or the heart to open, and to take care of self and others. I mean, awakening is probably best understood as an opening of the heart. It's an emotional experience. So the 3 refuges function as self-objects, providing a self-affirming experience or self-actualizing experience. Experientially, they have the quality of expansiveness. They're not something we take refuge in. Rather, the refuge is our experience. When we are in intimate relationship with them, As Thich Nhat Hanh might say, they interbe with ourselves. So the first one, taking refuge in Buddha. In terms of the three refuges, there are many different ways that they are interpreted in Zen Buddhism. I'm giving a particular personal interpretation here along the lines of self-psychology. So taking refuge in Buddha can be seen as an idealizing self-experience or a sense of belonging and being at home. So we could look at the historical Buddha as a cultural self-object, the actual, like, in the same way that Churchill during the Second World War acted as an idealizing self-object for a nation. The same way that you might have figures in your life that inspire you or you idealize in some way as a child or as an adult. Or we can have these fictional characters that can play the same role, or these historical characters like the Buddha, natural historical Buddha, that can play this role in our lives to inspire us. But if we look at the Buddha, not from the historical Shakyamuni, but if we see Buddha taking refuge in Buddha as taking refuge in Zazen. So in a sense, when we take refuge in Buddha, we take refuge in Zazen, right? So Zazen is really the core Zen Buddhist practice. Everything's contained in Zazen. If you read the Song of Zazen by Hakuin, which is in the Sutra book, everything is contained in Zazen. Okay. But Zazen is an activity, and that we call practice. So Zazen includes the activity of stillness, silence, and feeling the breath or contemplating a koan. All these activities are regulating and facilitating our self-experience moment by moment. As our body relaxes, we feel ourself relaxing, letting go of thoughts and surrendering to this moment. The self-experience of Zazen is self-affirming and self-actualizing. We may feel a greater sense of stability, sitting like a mountain. Feelings of gratitude might just naturally arise. Just the feeling of gratitude for being alive, falling in love with being alive. Our heart opens. We can also feel a sense of being held, non-judgmentally, in the loving arms of Zazen, a kind of maternal holding by something bigger and wiser, a kind of idealizing, self-affirming experience, self-intimacy, merging with this, the feeling of arriving home in the activity of Zazen. So that's one example of how an activity generates the sense of self-experience. Later, we might put that into words and tell a story about it, but it also arises without the story. We can actually feel how our self-experience changes from moment to moment in Zazen. You may not always experience this. Every sitting of Zazen is going to be different. But you might find yourselves being more prone to experience this sense of actually starting to appreciate being alive. And sometimes it might even be a very moving emotional experience for you, especially on a retreat, but even when we do our 40 minutes in the morning. The second refuge is Dharma. Again, Dharma gets interpreted in all different kinds of ways. So the Dharma, in a sense, is an idealizing experience. It's also a sense of belonging. So it's a sense of finding our home in a tradition which we feel comfortable in. For example, when I was in my late 20s or early 30s, I can't remember now, I experimented with the idea of becoming an Anglican priest, and I actually went to Morpeth College in Newcastle to start the process of study. I was already familiar with Zen Buddhism at the time, um, but I just couldn't find my home in that particular tradition. The scripture I just felt more at home in the Buddhist sutras. Just spoke to me, had more of affinity with the Buddhist tradition than the Christian tradition. So the sense of finding your home in a tradition, the sense of finding your home in the teachings, whether the teachings are the classical teachings in the sutras or the koans, or whether they're from contemporary Dharma talks. But the Dharma is not just the tradition and the teachings, as you will find when you study Zen Buddhism. We can also talk about the mountains and the rivers being our teachers, or even in our four practice principles, we talk about life as it is being the only teacher. So the nature itself is teaching the Dharma constantly. Everything, all of life is a teaching of the Dharma. And it probably teaches much better than I can when I try and put it into words. So nature, the earth, mountains and rivers, the sky, the blue vastness of the sky, the beauty of the stars at night, they're all teaching the Dharma, and they're all affirming self-experiences that we can have, like seeing the morning star. On the retreat that we were on at Yarrawarrah a couple of weeks ago, I talked about a book called The Salt Path. And in that book, the protagonist and her husband are basically evicted from their home and they have to know where to go. You lose a basic kind of, literally our home is often a kind of self-object. It's an affirming self-experience. Literally we come home, we can rest and relax and feel secure. That's taken away from you and you're homeless. And what they did was to walk this southwest walking track in England from through Cornwall and Devon for about a couple of months along the coastline, 365 miles. The activity of the walk itself created an affirming self-experience for them. Eventually, they found themselves being at home on the path, which enabled them to make that transition from that huge crisis that they were experiencing in their lives at that time. So just the activity of walking together, husband and wife together, walking that path together was transformative. Finally, Sangha, the third refuge. Again, that's an important way in which we get the mirroring recognition aspect of our practice. It's important. We've got to pay very much attention to creating a welcoming Sangha, a Sangha that welcomes people, where people feel appreciated and acknowledged. That provides a recognition, that sense of twinship and belonging and finding our relational home in a Sangha. That includes the relationship with the teacher and includes the relationship with Sangha members. And hopefully that provides for that sense of recognition. But also we can widen out that sense of Sangha. We can include relationships with family and friends in Sangha, and indeed the wider community. So often our needs for recognition are going to come from our relationships with people. They may come from relationships with pets as well. And so it's that sense of that two-way recognition that the Sangha relationships can provide. Finally, I just want to say something about what self-psychology talks about when they talk about how we can lose these self-object, these affirming self-object experiences. It's called disruption and restoration. And that's central to the process of therapy. So it's now considered inevitable in therapy that the therapist will say or do something which is not empathically attuned to the client, which will disrupt the relationship either in a minor way or in a major way. In the same way, it's possible for a teacher or a Sangha member to say or do something that disrupts your self-experience of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We can appreciate how disruptive Joko Beck's teacher, Maizumi Roshi's unethical actions were and how that affected Joko, right? However, because she was really grounded in Buddha and Dharma, she was able to survive that and establish her own Zen school. So she repaired that damage by developing her own teaching and her own school of Zen. Often, however, these little sort of disruptions will just be these small T traumas. And if that's ever the case in our Sangha for you, it will be my sincere hope you will be able to discuss that with me or with the Sangha member themselves. That's why we place so much emphasis on creating a culture of safety in our Zen Sangha, so that we will not avoid difficult issues if we need to talk about them. So in conclusion, for me, the three refuges over time have become so central to what it means to be a Buddhist for me. I find the longer I practice, the greater importance they take in my life. And there are many ways of understanding and relating to them. I hope the talk today offered a slightly different perspective, but I would continue, but all of you, to continue to encourage you to personalize these three refuges. What do they personally mean to you? So that they become an intimate part of yourself and what it means to be a Buddhist. So thanks for being here this morning and listening. And we've got 15 minutes for questions or comments or sharing. So I'll turn off the recording and say goodbye to our listeners who are listening to this recording. Thank you for listening to this recording if you've got to the end. And okay, bye for now.